So hello again, everyone. Hopefully you're in the right place. Quick fixes make your breadcrumb trails better. So let's get started with this. And like I said, we don't have a ton in this particular session, which is actually not bad to have something that's kind of bite-sized. So this is something that not a lot of people know. So it's not something that we cover in initial training because I don't know how many of you were around when your libraries got their very first training, but it tends to be a little overwhelming. And this is one of the finer points of managing your site. So I'm happy that you're here or that you're going to be watching this later, perhaps if you're not here today. And so let's start with just a quick review of URL aliases. So I'm sure probably all of you know that you can set a specialized URL for any particular program, event, page, whatever that is. You can create a special URL for it. And the reason for doing that is usually, first of all, it's shorter, right? But also because that way you've got a specific, more memorable URL that you can put on your different kinds of promotional materials or into your social media. So when you create a URL, you probably remember that kind of by default, you typically get something like what you see here, where we've got the base URL of the library. I'm just using example library.org. You can substitute in whatever your URL is in mentally /content/ and then you get the title of whatever it is, usually hyphenated. But what if you want something more memorable? Well, then you want something like this, right? You want to be able to tell people to go to example library.org /something. In this case, we'd used cool program. And so you're probably also going to remember this. This is the part of the user interface when you're creating content that allows you to basically create something specialized. So you'll probably also remember that that checkbox there, generate automatic URL alias, is the default. That is checked by default. And that's how you get this /content/ hyphenated title. When you want something that is more specialized, like what we just did in the first slide, /cool program, you uncheck that box, you get a space then to put in your particular URL alias. Boy, that is hard to say. URL alias. So it's going to be /something. So this is not new. But what I want to show you today is how you can make this work for you a little bit better. So this especially comes into play with book pages because I'm sure, as you already know, book pages kind of live in a structure, right? There's a parent page and then there's child pages of that parent. And then some of those child pages can even have child pages of their own. So what people don't necessarily realize is that this here, the breadcrumb trail, that's what this is called. I guarantee you know what this is. Maybe you didn't know that was the name that it has, is actually connected to your URL alias. Now, here's a top level book page, in this case /about, and probably all of your sites have something very similar to this where you've got /about us or something very much like that. And that's usually a top level book page, right? But what if you have children? So you'd think that your breadcrumb trail would be something like this, where you'd get something like, okay, if I have a child page under About Us called Services, you would think that you would get your breadcrumb trail would be all the way back at the left would be Home, which then leads to the About Us level, which in turn leads to the Services level. But that's not actually what you'll see if without using this little fun tweak. You'll see this Home, Services, no About Us, because the URL is going to be /services, which seems very intuitive until you realize that you don't get a good breadcrumb trail out of it. So what we want to do is we want to make this better. So what we really want is this, right? And if we look at the URL of the book page, that's probably what we want is /about /services, because what that means is that someone could take off /services, go to /about, and they would get to the About Us page. So we want to make this intuitive so that the URL alias and the breadcrumb trail mirror each other, because remember, they are connected. So this is what we usually see, right? We see slash services, and then we end up with this breadcrumb trail, even though the services page is probably under about us. Now, if services is a top level option in your navigation, slash services is perfectly okay, and you want that. But if you have something that is a child page and it's a couple levels down at least, you're going to want things to be the same in both your breadcrumb trail and your URL alias. So how do we make these match? The secret is in the URL alias because it does all of the heavy lifting. You just have to structure your URL alias. So here we go. So I already mentioned this, but I'll show it here again. So if we have an About Us as a top level book page, probably on your main navigation, it's going to be slash about or something like slash about us, or it may be a little different from site to site depending on what you assigned or what was assigned, but hopefully you get the idea. That's the top level. But if services is underneath that, we want to structure our custom URL, our URL alias, to be slash about slash services. So again, we're going to be making our URL alias mirror the breadcrumb trail and vice versa. And it's all done through the URL alias. So the power is really here. And you can see this in action here in the user interface where we've got slash about slash services. So can you do this if a book page, say, is multiple levels down? So maybe you have something like meeting rooms, which is going to be under about or under services, which in turn is under about. So now we've got 3 levels, right? Because we've got about as the top level, we have services under about, and then services has its own child page, meeting rooms. So what would that look like? It would look like this: slash about slash services slash rooms. Now, it's important to note that when you are creating your URL alias, that when we talk about slash anything, that slash anything has to actually exist. So slash about has to exist as a book page. Slash services has to exist as a book page. And slash rooms has to exist as a book page. If say your meeting rooms book page isn't called slash rooms, this isn't going to work. You're not going to get anything that works either in your URL alias or in your breadcrumb trail. So you have to make sure that all the pieces and parts are there before you start creating these kinds of URL aliases. You have to have all of the different levels accounted for. You can't just decide, well, you know what, we have this book page called meeting rooms, and its URL alias is actually slash meeting rooms. You can't suddenly decide on the fly when you're creating a URL alias to call it slash rooms. It has to actually have that URL alias already. So I told you this was really quick today, right? Some of you may have already joined and you all just about missed it. This is a really, really short piece. And I like to do this because so many folks don't know that this is a possibility. And it's one way that you can make navigation in your Webkit a lot better for your users, because they can see a breadcrumb trail that actually reflects the structure of what your site looks like. So very short, I know, but I want to take any questions that you might have about this. And if you're not typing, perhaps some of you can tell me if this was new to you or not. My own experience has been that this is new to folks, but sometimes people have figured this out or we've talked about it. If you have other questions, please feel free to reach out to me, Laura at oakland.ohio.gov. And I want to thank you for taking just a few minutes out of your morning this morning. And Elizabeth, that's perfectly okay that it's new. That's why we do it. If it wasn't new, we wouldn't do this at all, right? And Chris says, I had used the custom URLs, but I hadn't connected the dots in terms of breadcrumbs. That's not something I think that's real intuitive unless you've played around with it. Elizabeth says, explains why I've been confused on other websites. It really helps to have that structure reflected in all the places, right? So it makes sense. Okay, you're very welcome. Thanks, folks, for joining me this morning for just a few minutes. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me directly. Thanks for coming again, and enjoy the rest of your morning.